Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us in this virtual seminar. We're really happy to have you all here to start this initial conversation on from COVID-19 to climate change and mapping the gender, peace and security implications in the Asia Pacific. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the land on which we're hosting and recording this seminar today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I also acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians on all the lands on which we're meeting today in this virtual seminar. And the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today in the seminar. So we pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging. My name's Karen Baker. I'm a research fellow in Pacific politics at the Australian National University, and I'm really happy to welcome you to this seminar hosted by the Department of Pacific Affairs and the Department of International Relations at the Coral Bell School here at the ANU. So thanks very much to everyone for attending. Just some housekeeping before we get started. So you've all been muted coming in, and can I ask everyone to remain muted unless they're speaking, so we can mitigate against any background noise. The seminar is being recorded and it'll be uploaded as a podcast for those who couldn't make it this afternoon. And the seminar is a Q&A format, so we're going to start with some prepared questions and then later we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And if you have a question, there's a couple of options for how to ask it. You can use the chat function. So if you click on the chat box at the bottom of your screen, the chat will come up on your right, and you can type out a question and submit it that way. The second option is raising your hand. So for this, you click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and a list of participants will appear on the right as well. And at the bottom of that list, there's a little blue hand symbol. So if you click on that hand symbol, I'll be able to see that you want to ask a question. So now I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. First we have Betty Barker, a PhD candidate with the Centre for Gender, Peace and Security at Monash University and an advisor for the Frida Young Feminist Fund. And Betty's current research is focused on the gendered implications of climate change-induced relocation and displacements in the Pacific. We have Sharon Bhagwan-Rolls, a second-generation Fiji Island feminist working on the intersections of gender, media, communications, and peace. Now she's currently the chairperson and gender liaison of the Board of Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. She's a technical advisor for the Pacific Regional Shifting the Power Coalition and co-chair of the Board of Directors of the Global Fund for Women. So she has a wealth of experience on gender, peace and security. We also have Carla Silbert, the Governance, Peace and Security Specialist for UN Women Regional Office in Asia and the Pacific, and the Officer in charge of UN Women Philippines. And Carla's work focuses on women, peace and security, women's access to justice, and the prevention of violent extremism. And we also have Maria Tanyag, a research fellow in ANU's Department of International Relations. Maria's current research is in exploring where conflicts, disasters, economic recessions, health epidemics, and rising fundamentalisms constitute the overlapping gendered risks and hazards impacted by climate change in the Philippines and elsewhere in the Asia Pacific region. So I'm really excited to start the discussion. And to start off with, I wondered if our speakers could tell us something about how COVID-19 has affected life in Asia and the Pacific and the gendered effects that we might be seeing. And we'll start with Betty, if that's all right.
Sure. Thanks, Karen and Maria, for having us, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I guess to the question of how COVID has affected life in the region, basically what I feel has been a common theme has been that of disruption and disparity. And we can see a lot of this has just magnified existing disparities in communities, but also disrupted everyday lives. And what we considered normal has definitely been changed. And as in any crisis, it is also gendered, whether it be a natural disaster or whether it be a financial crisis or a pandemic, it is gendered. And it's really funny because I heard somebody say the other day that we're all in this together, but the patriarchy is still on, which means that this is impacting women way more than it is impacting men. Not to say that the individual women or the individual men, but more as a marginalized group, women are being affected more and more vulnerable. I think content across the digital space has increased in terms of identifying the gendered impacts of what the pandemic would look like in the region or globally. And they're very clear impacts that are, there will be an increase in violence against women. There has been a notable increase in calls to crisis centers. The burden of care has increased multifold for women working from home and homeschooling. The economic crisis has also been particularly detrimental for women, and even more so for younger women. So this has been a major challenge for those who are already struggling to make ends meet with casual opportunities, or if they were single mothers and leading their homes. This has definitely made them more marginalized and put them in a very vulnerable position. Lockdown preventative measures have added to this burden, whereby not only have they lost their jobs, but they're unable to access any support mechanisms which would otherwise be available to them, not only in terms of accessing crisis support, but also having that sort of security net whereby they could go to somebody on a regular basis and, you know, speak to them about it. This is also taking into account that in the region, this is a two-bladed sword really for women, because not only is the jobs that they're doing most affected, the hospitality, tourism, and retail sector, which largely employs women, but it's also that those who are considered to be on the front lines and doing the daily job, that are nurses, caretakers, cleaners, they're also women. But not only are they caretakers and leaders in their professional workspace, but they're also doing this in the household environment. And so sort of getting that balance right. I think the pandemic has also been a barrier in terms of accessing basic services and basic needs. So of course, there was always the issue of access to drinkable water in the region, but particularly for developing nations. That has gotten worse. You can't assume that people have access to clean, safe water to wash their hands if they had constantly been fighting for access to safe water, and contaminated water has been an issue in the region. The access to medical care and legal services is also a very, very key component. I think the UNFPA has projected some 6 months of lockdown would result in 7 million unplanned pregnancies globally, and approximately 31 million cases of sexual and gender-based violence. I think those numbers are extremely detrimental and devastating, really. They're horrifying, but they're projections. The reality is a whole different thing, and we don't know what that would look like. So those are very clear ones. The other thing is that around climate change as a threat multiplier, climate change researchers have constantly been saying that climate change is a threat multiplier, and we've been giving examples over the years around how that's happening. It just so for some reason, it always only happens when a crisis strikes that people realize, oh, it really is a crisis. And we've been thinking about taking a proactive approach to what this would look like. So say, for instance, in South Asia, where Cyclone Amphan had hit, and in the South Pacific, where Tropical Cyclone Harold hit, the concept of stay home was not even applicable because homes were blown away. So how can you stay safe and stay home when there are no homes to stay in? And evacuation center problems are already existing. We know that it's impossible to stay socially at a safe social distance. You know, evacuation centers are crammed. There are multiple other issues that result from that. So I think those are some very clear challenges that have come up, and the gendered implications are also very much documented recently. And I think there's a lot of content around the gendered impacts of COVID, but with this disruption has also come a lot of opportunities that are ways to go forward. And I think there are a few key lessons, which I'll probably highlight later, which are opportunities for us to sort of build on and think about what COVID would look like post-COVID. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Betty. Sharon.
Thanks. Thanks, Betty, for setting out the scene, and I'm apologizing now for the pets in the background. They're not mine. But I think, you know, even before we started to look at the realities of COVID-19, a very important lesson learned, or what we were tracking also as the Shifting the Power Coalition, as well as GPAC here in the Pacific, was the Samoa measles epidemic. And I think that's been a very important lesson learned about how the importance of organizing the health sector, and how to also look at the gendered inequalities when it comes to healthcare, resources, information, and the added burden of the unpaid care work of Pacific Island women. So I think that was really, as we started to look at COVID, we had already started to see some of this at the national level. On top of the, you know, the diversities of women leaders, it's been important for us to also working in collaboration with the Pacific Disability Forum to look at the diversities of women, and on top of, you know, the challenges around social distancing, etc., as Betty highlighted, what does that actually mean when you're a woman with disability and when you are relying on other persons to provide you with support? So we were indeed looking and tracking COVID-19. We did a very rapid assessment across the 6 countries of the Shifting the Power Coalition very early on in March. But then, of course, we were then tracking TC Harold. And both crisis situations remind us that in reality, we're not talking about one or the other. Even in this context of climate crisis, what is health security for women and their communities? We've recently just finished a rapid women's human security assessment for GPAC, and in collaboration with the Shifting the Power Coalition members. So we've identified from the outset something that we've been talking about already, but I think this is an opportunity now to really progress the peace, development, and humanitarian nexus. So right now, both in terms of COVID-19 and TC Harold, the quick assessment from Solomons to Fiji to Vanuatu and then on to Tonga have highlighted economic health and food security, as well as shelter, as Betty said, the community and personal security in the homes, and then also political security at the community level and at the national level. For women to be part of decision making, it is really vital to really start to unpack what are the decision making processes right now, and how can women be supported in these times of virtual meetings, of curfews and controls around movement. How do we get women to be part of this decision making? So one of the key recommendations in terms of what we've been saying to the Pacific Humanitarian Protection Cluster from the outset has been what we don't want to see in the response, whether it's COVID-19 or even in terms of climate change and in the situation of managing disasters, is we shouldn't be perpetuating discrimination, and we should be looking at new ways to overcome discriminatory practices. So it was very clear for us from the outset that, as I said, we're dealing with multiple crisis situations, but not just only at the national level. I think more and more as we look at the impact of successive Category 5 and other climate change induced disasters in our Pacific Island region, that we also have to break it down so that we're able to look at what does it mean for coastal women, what does it mean for rural women in the farming sector, what does it mean for young people and young women in urban communities that rely on employment, through these sectors. So it's really important that we're starting to also redefine resilience. I think that's clearly needs to be better understood. And in terms of what does the gendered impact mean, I think we were very proud of the way in which the ActionAid Vanuatu women, through Women Wet and Weather and the Women Who Talk Together network, were very quick to mobilize and organize using appropriate accessible information, in particular the SMS platform, to start to develop messages initially for COVID in collaboration with their Ministry of Health from the outset. But then they were quickly able to adapt the messaging also for TC Herald, and that was able to reach, more than 77,000 people. So I think when we look at the gendered impact of any crisis, we certainly have to take into account the imbalances, what needs to be balanced out in terms of the further exacerbation of discrimination. But we also need to be looking at what are the gendered opportunities, what can Pacific Island women also provide through our own learning, leadership, and innovation. I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Carla.
Thanks so much. And I think Betty and Sharon have really well articulated some of the major gendered impacts we're seeing, cutting across gender-based violence, certainly the economic dimensions and women's unpaid care work, which are hugely gendered in the region. And I think another dimension just to add to this, and I won't take up too much time on it, but is just to add, we're seeing obviously beyond climate change, intersections with many of the other challenges women are facing in the region, and particularly for women in conflict-affected settings or fragile peace settings. Certainly COVID has really exacerbated some of those challenges. So we're seeing this in the Philippines, in the south of Thailand, and in Myanmar. There's just some examples of environments in which the fragile peace is really being threatened, more so by COVID, by the context of increased securitization, increased surveillance, and how the lockdowns and restrictions on movement are infecting women in these environments. One other dimension I just wanted to add as well is the particular gendered impact this is having on migrant women in the region, particularly looking at Southeast Asia, where there are such high numbers of women working, particularly as domestic workers abroad, who have now been trapped by closed borders, now with no work, no pay in foreign countries, where they have no support, and real high vulnerabilities to violence in those contexts, and also returned migrant workers that now have no employment or income support in their home country, and are also really vulnerable to stigma and discrimination, which is very gender-based as well. We've seen in a number of countries in the region a lot of hate speech and rhetoric targeted towards women and women as migrant workers, particularly a lot of fear that women have brought back the virus from abroad, and this is exacerbating all the pre-existing misogynistic speech and social norms in these contexts.
Thanks so much, Carla. And I wondered on that point, on the intersections of these multiple challenges, a crisis really on multiple fronts. Whether Maria, you could talk about how we see climate change and hypermasculine governance and the global economic crisis that is looming, how these are overlapping in the Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Karen and everyone. I think I'd like to begin by mapping three main trends that we are seeing. And this is largely building on what Betty, Sharon, and Carla have already mentioned. But we see three main trends in terms of, first, gender research and analysis is never more widely accepted than before. And I think this is testament to the progress of the Women, Peace and Security agenda globally and in the region, the proliferation of feminist scholarship across peace and conflict studies, in disaster studies, environmental resource management, and also on climate change. And we can look at all the growing body of scholarship and how it is in some ways being incorporated to create policy transformations. So in the region, we know that there are action plans around that have been incorporating gender analysis, at least in writing, incorporating gender analysis to create more inclusive and responsive approaches to peace and security. However, there is also a growing concern that contrary to initial radical feminist visions that see women's knowledge and worldviews as transformative of the material and ideological structures of societies, we are actually seeing that rather than being alarm bells that signal where insecurities lie, gender analysis and approach tend to be co-opted into more bureaucratic processes and are therefore reduced to more background noise. The second is, as Karen pointed out, that we are seeing intersecting crises. But as Sharon, Carla, and Betty mentioned, these are not new phenomena especially for the Asia Pacific. And we have been dealing with a lot of these multiple hazards across all domains of human life even before. But what we are seeing and what the IPCC reports are telling us, that these multiple hazards are going to happen more frequently and with greater intensity, which means we will have very little or shorter timeframes between one crisis after another, but also that our existing toolkits and ways of conceptualizing security are going to be inadequate very, very soon. And I want to draw on, to make that more concrete, on my experience researching in the Philippines around displacement sites caused by conflicts and disasters. And for many of you who know, again, the region, I was speaking to some of the responders in both conflicts and disasters, and they were saying that there is now a tendency to have what they call forgotten crises, which I thought was an oxymoron of some sort, because a crisis tells us that we are moved and motivated to act. But at the same time, because we're having so much of these crises, that there is now a competition over political will and resources. And certainly that is what we are seeing, sadly, at the moment. And there is a way in which these forgotten crises thrive, especially in authoritarian settings or in highly militarized or securitized responses to crises. And we can talk a bit about that again when we look at the Philippines and what's happening there, where we see one crisis is brushed to the side to prioritize over another. And there are ways in which the rhetoric of crises is manufactured for certain political ends. And finally, I think I want to point out the third trend, which is that we are really seeing regressions and reversals. And I think Carla already mentioned this, that peace is really fragile, because there is also a growing body of evidence that indicate that whatever peace gains we have had in certain pockets in the region, these are being reversed because of climate change and the succession of different forms of crisis, including the current health pandemic. So in the most recent UN ESCAP, or the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific report, they actually argue that on its current trajectory, the Asia and the Pacific will actually not achieve all 17 SDG goals by 2030. And this is largely because progress has been stagnant stagnant, and in some specific areas, countries are even registering negative trends. And these are largely around the food production, access to water, shelter, renewable energy, much of the same points that the other speakers have pointed out. So it is really worrying, and that in a way we need to actively think about when we're trying to look at the intersections of multiple crises, that we have toolkits to understand the interaction effects of different insecurities, and that we do not have at this stage, because existing frameworks and approaches and even ways of viewing peace and security are siloed and fragmented. And this is, I think, what Sharon pointed out, that we need to think about humanitarian development and peace nexus, but also we need to do more of that in terms of understanding how interventions in one area might actually counteract or even negate interventions in other security areas. But I'll leave that there, and just kind of seeing that these are the broad trends that we are grappling with. And we do not have the answers at this stage, but I think it's something that we collectively need to think about.
Thanks so much, Maria. I want to turn now to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and its role and relevance in this changing context in the Asia Pacific, in light of these new and exacerbated security threats. So are we seeing explicit engagement with the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the response to COVID-19? And should we be seeing more engagement? Sharon.
Thank you. I'm just actually going to take a little bit step back pre-COVID to 2015, following the global study on UNSCR 1325 that was authored by Radhika Kumaraswamy, and I had an opportunity to be part of the Global Civil Society Advisory Group. One of the things that we were quite pleased as Pacific Island women in terms of the Security Council Resolution 2242 that was adopted that year was the inclusion of climate change, that was a reminder once again to the Security Council of its responsibility to include climate change in its work around prevention. But if I could just quote the resolution, because I think this once again is a classic reminder of the siloing of WPS as well, not just right now, but as part of the challenge for us as feminist peace builders, because the resolution actually talks about the impact of climate change and the global nature of health pandemics, and then reiterating the relevance of the WPS agenda in that way. So already the Security Council itself, already as women, peace and security activists, we have been saying that, peace is not just about the absence of war. But one of the challenges I have seen and experienced is that when it comes to the political negotiation, even around the Beijing Platform for Action, even when it comes to talking about whether it's relevant to talk about Security Council resolutions, it's very easy to push peace building approaches aside, even though there's such a critical need to invest in sustaining peace and conflict prevention. So we see as Shifting the Power Coalition and GPAC Pacific, the importance of the WPS agenda as a framework to help respond to COVID. But what is the challenge, yet again, is there is active and very important response to addressing prevention and response to gender-based violence and domestic violence, because we are seeing an increase in the reports, as Betty mentioned, locally, but also from a number of other Pacific Island countries. And yet the WPS agenda is a lot broader than that. It's about an integrated, coherent approach to political security, development, human rights, gender equality, and the rule of law, as reflected in UNSCR 2122. So it's been important for us to look at how to continue to advocate for the WPS agenda beyond just, and even trying to open up the protection mechanism as well. So we've been able to contribute to a briefing paper together with UNFPA and UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights here through the Pacific Humanitarian Protection Cluster as some guidance to military and how they mobilize, because it is critical that this is not a peacekeeping deployment. This is not waging, it's not an armed conflict per se. So that's been very important to ensure. And also, I think one of the things that we're also hearing about, particularly at the local level, in the context of village communities, etc., is the instructions that are coming from the national level in terms of the COVID-19 response, such as curfews, such as limitations, and other security priorities, is not actually being communicated in a way that will result in peaceful communities. We've actually had a situation here in Fiji where a village headman was killed as a result of him trying to follow the procedures or the directives from the police. So I think these are some of the challenges that we need to be thinking about, and how in bringing a women, peace and security agenda into the conversation, we are also bringing the humanitarian actors into this process. We're bringing in faith leaders, we're bringing in traditional leaders, as well as the women's community and all our diversities. I think the challenge here is how do we build on the foresight of the Pacific Regional Action Plan on women, peace and security, and how do we get better at integrating the women, peace and security agenda in the humanitarian response in line with the pillars of WPS, so prevention, participation, protection, relief and recovery. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Carla, your thoughts on the role and relevance of the women, peace and security agenda?
Thanks. Yeah, I would certainly echo those views, and probably just to add as well that while we're not in an armed conflict situation, thankfully, there are so many unfortunate elements that do mirror one, that evoking national emergency powers the way that they've been invoked, the militarized response, and because of all of these, we're actually in quite a good position to try and take from the women, peace and security agenda all the lessons that we've learned. We actually know from 20 years of working on it that there are really, really useful dimensions that we could apply right now. So we have tools around peace building and kind of trying to prevent the eruption, COVID acting as a conflict driver, which we're seeing happen in many contexts. And also it really sets out a pathway for what we should be doing to prepare for early recovery. But I don't think we're seeing the WPS agenda used as a guide well enough. There's so many more things we could be learning from it. And we're seeing trends like in the Philippines, there's been a number of reported incidents of police at checkpoints trading sex for the ability to cross the checkpoints or quarantine, to be able to breach quarantine. Now, these are things that really mirror conflict-related sexual violence issues, and we have lessons learned from those. We know what we need to be doing in terms of documenting these kinds of human rights and women's rights violations right now, what they might lead to in the future in terms of ensuring accountability, but not waiting until the aftermath to turn around and say, oh, this was the documentation we should have been doing, this was the accountability mechanisms we should have pushed for, and now it's in the aftermath of something that we've seen, I've said, oh, those 6 months was just crazy, we can't possibly address it in a way that really does ensure the rule of law is applied. So I think for many of the dimensions of what we're seeing, we're in a very good position to take the lessons of WPS at its best and be able to apply them now.
Thanks so much, Carla. Betty?
Okay, you can hear me now. All right, thanks everyone. Again, just echoing what Sharon and Carla have already said. But also in a recent report that Monash GPS did through a rapid assessment of women, peace and security practitioners in the Indo-Pacific region, the respondents showed that a lot of them had to redirect particular project money into humanitarian and crisis response. And that was just the flexibility with which they had to manage their program priorities. I guess it was also around understanding the insecurities that it brings and sort of getting an overview of the overall sense of donor support that would come for these projects going forward. I think the other thing I would like to emphasize is women, peace and security organizations have been working across the intersections of this. And there has been some conversation around the language with which coronavirus has been portrayed as, the invisible enemy or those at the front lines. And this is very security studies language. So obviously it just becomes a peace and security agenda because of the nature of its involvement, which is why women, peace and security agenda is extremely critical to this. The other issue that I would like to, I guess it isn't an example from the region, but it's not to say that it's not possible in the region. And this has been from a very rapid assessment in Colombia, where as soon as schools became, as soon as people started working from homes and universities shut down, armed groups started recruiting younger people to join the armed forces. So what's to say that that sort of narrative isn't being followed? So recruitment for violent and armed conflict isn't happening in the region. It's just something that we can't particularly document at this point. And just sort of understanding that that's very deeply rooted in the peace and security agenda. The final point I had to make was around the call for ceasefire from the UN. And I guess that's, again, adding to the language around peace, very traditional security language. Calling for a ceasefire on global violence has been something that the UN Secretary General has called for, but he's also called for a ceasefire on domestic violence. And so that's been an interesting narrative to follow, just recognizing that, the role of the peace and security sector in this pandemic is extremely crucial, but it's also like a longer term, more sustainable, development related issue that we need to prioritize and integrate and see how that carries out. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And now there's been a lot of global attention on the role of women leaders in the response to COVID-19 and how well they're doing. What difference does it make to have women's participation in decision-making in meeting these complex security challenges? Sharon.
Okay, so I'm just also going to answer two questions that came my way via the chat. So the paper that I mentioned that's been produced, protection cluster, that should be available from UNFPA. Otherwise, I can make sure it's out. Oh, you could go to the GPAC Pacific Facebook page and find it there. So, and when I refer to WPS, I mean Women, Peace and Security. So to come back to your question, Karen, women's participation. Many years ago when we used to talk about gender equality, I used to use an acronym about a bird needs two wings to fly. And I think when it comes to addressing the complexities of security challenges, I mean, it's whose security are you talking about as well, which is why we've been taking as specific peace builders a human security approach and a focus more on prevention rather than reaction. So I think what's important here is to think about the complexities that we are already in even before the crisis, and how these complexities also challenge us to participate in decision making around climate crisis situations. So one is obviously that for us in the Pacific Island region, we don't just rely on the sort of the Western notion of political decision making. So women need to be elected into parliament, women need to be elected into local government. We're not doing very well on that in the Pacific Island region. If you followed the Vanuatu elections recently, we're not getting the numbers, and we've done fairly well in Fijian parliament, but there's obviously a need to get better at transforming those political systems, while at the same time, I think we need to look at a greater focus on local government, the provincial, subnational decision making, as well as the traditional system. So, for example, here in Fiji, while you may look at a traditional decision making setup in an indigenous village and say, well, it's really only about the men. I was having a conversation with Andi Basulebu from Transcend Oceania, which is the regional secretariat of GPAC here. And we were talking about how, well, actually, the support that's needed is for the Indigenous Women's Network, the Song of Akamarama, for the women to have those resources and the time and the space to be able to prepare their input into these village meetings where decisions are made. And obviously then being part of a process where more women are being recommended into other official processes as well. So I want to start by making that point. I think also in terms of when we talk about human security or the issue of the complexity of security challenges, I think for those dealing with traditional security approaches, they find gender equality and inclusion quite complex. So for us, it's really about how do we help them actually understand how to integrate the Women, Peace and Security Council resolutions, human rights treaties, etc., to help them be better in developing peace-building regional security architectures. ActionAid, which is a member of the Shifting the Power Coalition, has actually developed a gender-responsive framework to respond to climate change, and looking at this integrated or this gendered nexus approach to climate change, disasters, and gender equality. And there are 4 key areas around how to make sure, or 4 key actions that are recommended. So one is obviously women's participation in policy spaces. And we'll have a conversation a little bit later about what are the role of development partners in these responses. So that's one. If women aren't in the room, decisions should be made. What does it need to get women into the room? Obviously, resources. And when we talk about women, Betty, we're talking about young women, we talk about women with disability, LGBTQI, so the diversity as well. The other issue also, particularly in negotiating spaces around regional security processes, we had to work very hard many years ago to help regional security officials actually value women's leaders and their local knowledge, their traditional peace building practice. We shouldn't have to do that. So I think it's once again changing the mindset of these officials. It's shifting the gender norms as well across all the domains and coming back to not just siloing women into one specific kind of situation, but actually taking that nexus approach and recognizing, as we have done as women, because we can just feel, okay, we're pushed aside, we'll just wait for somebody to make a decision for us. But through the women's movement in the Pacific, through the feminist movement as well, we are actually organizing together and coming up with our own localized solutions. So coming back to the Pacific Regional Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, it was way too progressive, I would say, in terms of meeting this nexus approach, but it was there, and it came from women, and it came from women's lived reality. But what it didn't get was resourcing. So it's really important that in this current process, and that's what we're trying to do, is to keep reminding Pacific Island officials that you have had recommendations, and they have been endorsed by Pacific Forum leaders, just as the Boe Declaration, just as the Big Katawa Declaration. I think the other thing also in overcoming the challenge of decision making is collaboration. And this is what we've been able to do through the Shifting the Power Coalition. We bring women peace builders, we bring local women leaders, we bring young women leaders, we bring women with disabilities as leaders together to come up with the strategies. And that is important, because it's not about creating another organization. It's just about having the time and space to be able to learn, strategize, and then take the information and influence many spaces. So that's really important as well, is that learning, that opportunity, and coming out of the silos of development thinking that, oh, you're working on peace and security, so you're working here. So what we've actually seen is that within not just GPAC in the Pacific, but GPAC at another level, even global conversations that are happening now, is starting to think about the impact of climate change, the reality of disasters, humanitarian issues, the role of innovative and accessible information communication. So for me, I talk about redesigning the table, and so I think these challenges actually provide us with opportunities, but we also have to hold the decision makers accountable to actually really redesign the table and invest in the architecture accordingly. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Maria, I wanted to go to you on this question of the importance of women's participation in decision making.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I think building on what I mentioned earlier, that there is now a strong evidence base to the difference that women's participation make, and we can create a distinction there, as Sharon have pointed out, about the high-level participation of women in very formal decision-making processes. So when we look at the data around women, peace and security and peace processes, there are quantitative and qualitative research that show that when you have women in peace processes, and particularly direct participation in negotiating the terms of peace, these peace agreements tend to last longer, and they tend to include components that are not just very state-centric or military driven. Rather, that they tend to include concerns, socioeconomic concerns, and also more long-term ideas about what it means to rehabilitate and reconstruct societies in the aftermath of conflicts. Similarly, we find strong evidence base when it comes to environment decision-making. Research show that when women participate, although that is still very, very small and minimal, especially when we look at the Conference of Parties climate change negotiations. However, when you do have women participating, it is also at both global and national levels, they tend to again include more diverse interests and perspectives that ultimately change the nature of the outcomes of these decision making. And so a good example of that, the Gender and Climate Change Index, I'm trying to forget now, show that when women are participating in environmental decision making, they are also where societies are making real investments to the well-being of its citizens. So there are a lot of lessons to learn. So we know that women do make a big difference, but where we're not seeing real transformations, as Sharon pointed out, is around the resourcing, right? Where you have very beautiful plans, action plans, and visions for change, we're not seeing real transformations on the ground. And what scholars argue, and I myself would agree, is that there is a disconnect between these beautiful programs, policy frameworks, and the real recognition and acceptance of women's everyday knowledge, one, but also that we are seeing, as I've mentioned earlier, that this radical and very integrated ideas around peace and security tend to be fragmented and depoliticized when it comes to actual implementation. And we are seeing three main issues here as well. When we start looking at women's participation, often women are relegated, particularly looking at evidence from the Asia Pacific, we see that women tend to be siloed into soft issues, and often, for example, around resource management, women aren't there, and therefore if you're not seeing women in these real hard issues of, you know, where economic and decision making is happening, then that gets reproduced at the global level. Because if you're not seeing women in the national level around Ministry of Environment and military or defense, you're not going to see that at the global level. But it's also the point about not just that women are fragmented, but that when they are in spaces and of actual decision making, and we know this again from literature around environment and peace and disasters, they tend to be very marginal in broader you know, teams and networks, to the extent that they cannot even really raise real issues because their expertise is questioned, or that they are, even if they do have the expertise, for example, around ceasefire agreements, these are often excluded, and they get to their voice or expertise is reduced to their gender identity. So there are ambivalences there where you have women in very male-dominated environments, whether ministries or peace processes or any decision-making bodies, that gets replicated. And then finally, it's also the problem of, again, when we actually have women, so the recognition of them in very male-dominated positions, but also the disciplines itself are inhospitable. So when we think about the production of knowledge around what constitutes as an insecurity when it comes to economic crises, when it comes to environmental crises, and to the health pandemic, these are still very much focused on creating or harnessing the masculine and feminine attributes. So a good example would be, for example, when we think about the disproportionate impact on care workers and health professionals globally. To what extent is this a broader concern with the way the global economy relies on unpaid and devalued labor from migrant workers. And as we are seeing from the region, a lot of these tensions arise because we are not seeing real investments in the health sector, which is, again, largely a feminized and largely women-dominated profession. And so these are different stages in which we can start unpacking, because there are progress and there are spaces for innovation, but I think we need to rapidly change the way in which women's participation and knowledge is valued.
Thanks very much. The reality of this crisis that's occurring on multiple fronts in addition to COVID-19 means that there's a greater need for women's participation at all levels of decision making, but crises have often been used to legitimate the sidelining of gender equality. So there's a bit of a paradox there. Is this something that we can expect to see in the region? Carla?
I think, unfortunately, yes, it is. And it is a reflection of what we've just been talking about, really an extension of the low levels of women's participation, and then how this becomes reflected in the crisis response. So if we look, for instance, at a country like Indonesia, where we have 17% of women in national legislature, now in the COVID task force, there are no women out of the 6-person executive board and 1 woman out of the 4-person advisory board for COVID response. And then we look to the national response plan for COVID, and we see a lack of gender mainstreamed language and integration, which is of course unsurprising. So really from that, in terms of sidelining gender equality, in all of these COVID national action plans at the moment, the trends we're starting to see so far are that as women are underrepresented in the legislative bodies and national, and the local bodies, we're also seeing that replicated. They're underrepresented in the task force teams. There's a lack of gender specific provisions and mentions in COVID response plans, lack of considerations, particularly in things like economic stimulus plans, where we're seeing a real discrepancy between the gendered impacts, particularly around the high level of women in the informal sector and of course the unpaid care work. And where there are services such as new gender-based violence services put in place, like hotline services, these are generally separate rather than being mainstreamed as part of the crisis response. So that low representation flows onto policy that way, and the sidelining of gender equality manifests in a couple of ways after that. It is in gender-blind policy responses, but it's also in the deprioritization of gender equality from what was existent before, where we can really see it sliding back. So, for instance, in the Philippines, ordinarily there's a 5% budget set aside for gender and development programming, but in the crisis, the president's been given extraordinary powers to reallocate the whole budget. And so there's a real risk now that that 5% will be diverted from gender-focused interventions. So that's just one example. I think another way that gender equality is being sidelined is that it's not to use another securitized language, but it's really part of the collateral damage of this hyper-masculinized governance, taking the new powers of being able to control movement, being able to control dissent, and shrinking civil society space, and really using the crisis as an extension of that. So I think that it is really targeting, in a way, women human rights defenders more so, because we're seeing all of these new national powers targeting criticism and dissent under the umbrella of tackling misinformation about COVID. But it really runs the risk of further marginalising women human rights defenders and making it much more difficult for them to do their work. So this has manifested in a lot of ways in the region. We've seen in some countries artists kind of charged for criticising the lack of COVID screening at airports on social media, for instance. There's new legislation that's enabling any dissenting voices to be removed in Bangladesh. There's a cyber news verification centre being established. There's been arrests in Pakistan of doctors and healthcare workers, highlighting the lack of PPE. And of course, if there's more women healthcare workers, this targets women more. So I think that that's really another dimension that is making it, making gender equality harder, particularly in terms of really raising women's rights and human rights concerns.
Thanks very much. Betty.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much, Carla, for that. I think just to echo everything that has been said, but also bringing to light that there has been research showing that post-COVID would look something like a post-conflict situation, whereby transition periods will require so many things to be trial and error based, as in most recovery and resilient rebuilding and recovery efforts. And so the role of women in sustaining economies, not just the care economy, but also economies, national economies, has been very crucial over the period. And this can be seen through cases of the Sri Lankan war and the Afghanistan cases, whereby women are holding up the buffer space. I think another key area, and Carla has mentioned this greatly, is around the funding for gender programs, and not just in national budgets, but I think also in the in the foreseeable future, it's important to see where the funding for women, peace and security programs or gender-specific investments in sustainable development, what the trends are like for that. I think there was a recent a report that said only 1% of gender-specific funding was reaching Pacific Islands women. And so what does that look like in the future? Will that be reduced? What does the amount look like? And sort of figuring out what the post-transition period would look like post-COVID. I think it's also understanding that, unfortunately, yes, gender equality will be on the sideline, but just to sort of get a sense of like, what is the trajectory that's being taken on by governments? Are gender budgets the first, to be reallocated? I think there was a recent news article around gender programs from national budgets being the first to be reduced as time goes on. But and I think it's very horrifying to see headlines such as hunger and poverty will kill more people in Asia than coronavirus. And I think that's very important to know, that most of these marginalized groups are women who are, you know, living on a day-to-day income, and the lockdown has severely impacted their livelihood. So it's just sort of getting a sense of that. And then, yeah, that's it.
Thanks so much. Before we move on, I just want to come back to Sharon. Do you have any comments on the sidelining of gender equality in the Fijian context and the Pacific more broadly?
I guess the situation, as I'm listening, and maybe to leverage from Betty's point, that this is about looking at political or post-conflict transition period. So we certainly do have a lot to learn from. But Karen, you and I were both in Bougainville for the historical referendum. And I think one of the points that we were making as GPAC Pacific from the outset in the lead up to the referendum is, this is more than just supporting the women to get to the referendum. What happens afterwards? So I think it's really about sustaining the women's movement and the different components of the women's movement, as well as supporting a political cycle of women in decision making. So not just, and this is what women are saying as well, this is not just about having, pre-election events to support women as candidates. So similarly, we shouldn't just be rallying around to say, okay, what are the women saying now? But how do we actually invest in the women, peace and security work that's ongoing, so that we're able to communicate that back into the process. So I think for the Pacific, it's the sustaining resources, build on the networks, uplift the WPS agenda in a way that Pacific Island women are able to provide the analysis and the recommendations. And let's just redesign the table so you have more women in the process, particularly when we're so underrepresented in the formal spaces. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So women, and especially health and community workers, are often described as the backbone or the front line in responding to both climate change and COVID. How true is this, and what do these labels mean for men and women in terms of building community resilience? Betty.
Sure, thanks, Karen. I guess I've mentioned this before, and it's such a shame that it took a pandemic for us to be able to say this out loud. But women have always been the backbone and the front line of any crisis. They've always been there. They've been doing this work, not just part of the care economy at home, but also in the formal spaces. It's just how this capitalist neoliberalistic model is, and what it chooses to recognize within the political economy of things, of what is valuable. I think also, just to add on what Sharon has already mentioned about resilience, is about redefining resilience and what it really means. Particularly when we're thinking about building community resilience, I think it's also important to just note what makes a community resilient, and being able to identify those key areas and being able to support it meaningfully over long periods of time. Building community resilience at this point has to be two-tiered, if not multi-tiered. And the first fold of this would have to look at the immediate actions that need to take place. And these are very context specific. Each country, each community will have their own set of priorities. Say, for instance, 11 or 12 of the Pacific Island countries have no confirmed cases of coronavirus, but that does not go to say that their economies will not be impacted. They're also going to be severely impacted because of border closures and loss of jobs and livelihoods. So what does this mean for them? And the second thing that needs to be prioritized is longer-term sustainable development. Maria has already mentioned that, on the current trajectory, it seems like none of these goals will be met. But I think it's also about taking a broader, more holistic approach, taking a human rights-based intersectionality approach, which looks into what is the priority that needs focusing. In the Pacific, I know for a fact that there are a lot of projects that are focused on resilience building and what it takes to build resilience of people. It's also moving beyond saying people are resilient and they'll come back up. It's about investing in what makes them more resilient, and what does this mean? And that has to be a shift. And Sharon keeps saying this, and I'm a huge fan of this redesigning the table model. And so I genuinely feel like shifting the power is one core element of building resilience, and shifting the power, making sure that communities are in, control of what it means to, to be building resilience. I think there are other key questions that this crisis has brought into light, and that's around what are our essential workers, and like, are they even being paid enough to be essential workers? It's also brought about the conversations around labor justice and being paid a living wage. So like the medical workers, the civil servants that are currently working day and night have been in recent years on the forefront of discrimination and stigmatization and abuse. And so what does this mean? Where are their rights? I know in Australia there was a report, as soon as the job losses started, there was an increase in union membership, but prior to that there wasn't that much engagement with the unions. What does this mean? What does this mean for labor movements and for multi-sectoral approaches going forward? It has to be an all hands on deck kind of approach going forward, which has to be tiered up accordingly, I think. And so just to reiterate that women and those of gender diversity have been on the front lines and have been sustaining and upholding the economies for years, and it won't change. I think it's just about shifting the way we recognize what these models look like and being able to appropriately acknowledge it going forward.
Thanks so much. My next question is on the role of development partners. What do you see as their role in responding to COVID-19 in the Asia Pacific and in mitigating its gendered impacts? Carla.
Thanks. I think that the key role of development partners should be supporting women's civil society and women's inclusion in decision making and in their ability to lead recovery efforts and receive the benefits of them. So everything that development partners do should be in support of that goal. So this encompasses things like working on essential actions like data gathering, which is really important right now. If we don't have the gender data on the impact of COVID, we're not going to get the gender response in national action. So conducting rapid gender analyses, impact assessments, including on socioeconomic impacts, is really important right now. It should also involve using development partners' capacity for internal coordination for resource mobilisation. So at the national level, humanitarian mechanisms that include UN country teams, multilaterals, donor governments are really strongly positioned to be mainstreaming gender in humanitarian response plans and ensure that resources mobilised have clear targets for gendered spending. So as part of this, financing mechanisms for gendered response are really important, and partners should be encouraging this. Recently, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund opened a new window of funding for local women's organisations responding to COVID in their communities, including for many countries in Asia Pacific. And importantly, it also had a stream for just institutional support, recognising that organisations are limited in their capacities to operate right now. So it's not just programming based. I think development partners can also be working a lot on the advocacy and strategic communication side to mitigate gendered impacts, and that it crosses all dimensions, from infection control to violence, vulnerabilities, right across the board. And another part of this role is very importantly through policy influence and the kinds of cooperative engagement with government counterparts that will allow prioritising gender in socioeconomic recovery approaches, and also in the peace and security recovery approaches. So I think these are receiving a lot less attention at present, but we need to be thinking about how development partners can support demilitarising communities now that have had checkpoints installed and police imposing lockdowns and curfews for a long time. And this is often in communities which have a long history of being over-policed, and it's very important that we work cooperatively to demilitarize them now in the aftermath. So some examples of this kind of coordination mandate would be supporting dialogues between government and women's civil society to ensure that women's voices are really included in these policy responses. And I think from the development side, we can really be pushing for accountability on these decisions, but prioritising the space for women from the grassroots up to have the platform themselves to push for accountability. And a real challenge at the moment is that all these consultations are virtual right now, and those living in the most remote locations that the most need to be part of the conversation are often excluded from them. So the lack of connectivity is a real challenge. And I'd just add, as one last point on that, a good example of some of this policy influence opportunity from development partners. So, for instance, like the Asia Development Bank engages in policy investment as a strategy, contributing financial support that is conditional on a government meeting policy accountabilities on gender-based violence, for instance. That's a really good mechanism for advancing gender responsiveness. Or a way that a multilateral like the UN, in its partnership with ASEAN, can be pushing right now for gender responsive regional strategies. So that's the kind of thing that could be very important for pushing for safeguards for women migrant workers in the region, as we were talking about earlier.
Thanks so much, Carla. Sharon.
So in terms of development partners, I mean, Carla's made some very good points. I just want to reiterate that this is, it's really important at this stage that as development partners, bilaterals, and the UN system are organizing the coordination around this massive UN humanitarian system, now more than ever, there needs to be an accountability in resource mobilization to multi-year funding, obviously, but also ensuring and having the conversations with our governments about supporting gender equality, having the conversations across your own government systems, your own agencies, so that the WPS agenda, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, is not lost in some kind of space because the person running the funding is a humanitarian person or development person, and they don't really see the connection. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done also within the development space to have your own conversations to integrate women, peace and security. I think the other thing also in terms, because we do hear it from development partners, donor agencies, that, well, these are massive amounts of funds. Can the women's groups, can they really manage it? So I will say yes, and this is how. We have mechanisms such as there's the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, such as the Global Fund for Women. There are feminist funds such as FRIDA. There's the Urgent Action Fund. There's even Fiji has their own women's fund. So that's the kind of collaboration that is possible, so that the funds have their arrangements to be able to support women get the kinds of resources that are needed. A number of smaller feminist collectives are saying, for example, we want to do the work, but we don't want to be doing the work with these sort of small grants that we then have to spend more time writing reports on. So these kinds of resources can break through some of these institutional silos, and particularly around peace building, where the shift has to happen from, as I said earlier on, from the prevention perspective, from seeing the COVID issues, seeing climate crisis as a human security priority. I think the other aspect as well is making sure that in addition to recognizing the women's funds, is also how women are collaborating. So the kinds of coalitions, networks, and groups where people are obviously, or women's groups actually collaborating and bringing their different strengths and together. So for Shifting the Power Coalition, for example, we've got the support of ActionAid Australia to support our coalition, not just as the pen holder, but obviously as a technical advisor, the lead technical advisor around the humanitarian space, because that's a huge maze as well for us to be learning, whether we're coming from peace building perspectives or community development. So that's going to be really important as well. And finally, we talk about, not homogenizing the kinds of needs. So for clearly for development partners is the issue of the prevention of age, gender, disability exclusion in humanitarian action, so that when the funding mechanisms are rolled out, we're not going to see the kind of disparities or the worsening of disparities that have been experienced prior to COVID, and obviously get worse at time of crisis, whether it's a health crisis or climate crisis. Thanks.
Thanks, Sharon. Betty.
Thanks, Karen. I have two very quick points, because Carla and Sharon have obviously done an incredible job answering that question. I think their development partners have a very key role to play, and it is no doubt that there will be some changes to the funding mechanisms going forward. It's about scenario planning for many civil society partners and community organizations. I think two examples I'd like to bring to your attention is that, as you know, I'm an advisor for Frida Young Feminist Fund, where we provide flexible grants for grassroots communities. And one of the things we've seen work really well is that these grants are flexible, so you don't have to, we try to make it easier for community-led initiatives that are focused on, young women priorities. And one of the things we've noticed is that helps in actually sustaining the programs, if not enhancing them. And for example, Brown Girl Work in Samoa had been doing this sort of work ever since the measles outbreak earlier in the year. And what this meant was that they were able to ask for very specific support going forward when the coronavirus pandemic hit. Rising Flame in India was an entirely disabilities focused program. What they decided to do was focus on well-being initiatives, which is also a key area that Frida likes to focus on personal well-being as a key tool for political warfare. So we really like to focus on the politics of self-care and feminism, as a core element of our work. The other one is that of the feminist bailout campaign by AWID, which has this broad call around bailing out people and not corporations going forward from the governments. And I think that's a very interesting initiative and sort of something that could play a key role for development agencies going forward. I think there's also just the knowledge, there's a lot of content being created, but how this content gets used going forward to shape implementation and action plans is very critical as well.
Thanks so much. We do have time for some questions. Please keep them short if you can, but just a reminder, you can use the chat box by clicking on the chat button, or you can click on the participants button and use the raise your hand feature. While we just wait for some questions, I'll start. If they're still all panelists, but please try and keep your answers short, maybe 30 seconds or less. Is COVID-19 going to change the way we think about and practice security, and how? Sorry, just a very, easy to answer question. I don't know who wants to go first. Sharon.
Okay, yeah. I think I'll start by asking the question, whose notion of security? So whose security are we talking about? And when it comes to security, as a number of us have said, there's been a really, we all share this concern about the militarization of COVID-19, the militarization or the securitization of the climate crisis. So for me, the shift is needed in terms of the narrative. For our region, Pacific Forum leaders, including Australia and New Zealand, have made a commitment to the Boe Declaration, which is a human security commitment. So I think there is right now a need to change the security approach by bringing in the missing link, the women, peace and security agenda, particularly in the Pacific humanitarian pathway to COVID-19. Otherwise, we're only just going to see it as a health crisis and not see the interlinkages. So for me, it's making those changes and making it more focused on human security that is inclusive and accountable to the women, peace and security agenda. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Carla.
Yeah, I think it should change the way we practice security. I hope it does, but it is the same thing, very much to extend on learning from the women, peace and security agenda and what we've seen work over the past 20 years, particularly given that it's the 20th commemoration of it this year. I think it exposes the limitations we have around women's underrepresentation in the security sector as a big dimension of this. And I think it also brings a number of issues that we haven't addressed enough in the WPS agenda to date, like cybersecurity. There's been so much more of a focus and a real exposure of the WPS dimensions of cybersecurity in this context. And I think there's going to be a real urgency to address some of those things going forward.
Thanks very much. Maria.
Great. Thank you again for everyone's thoughts. I think I had in mind the phrase Arundhati Roy said that the pandemic is a portal, right? I think whether or not COVID-19 will change how we understand security is really contingent on us. And when I think about how early feminist mobilization was able to envision radical agendas at that time, you know, to think about women's rights as human rights and to think about, you know, putting women at the center of decision makings, whether across environment, peace, and disasters. How they were able to do it is through the groundwork and very difficult work of consciousness raising. And I think we need more in order for us to get to turn this into a portal that can really envision radical notions of peace and security where societies can flourish and regenerate in the aftermath of crises. I think we really have to do a lot of this consciousness raising, as early feminist activists have told us. And what this early feminist activism has told us is that it is only by knowledge exchange and brokerage are we able to see, as Sharon pointed out, the interlinkages and to be able to also think about innovations and solutions to respond to the interlinking of these crises. So we need to learn more from our early feminist scholars, activists, and especially from the Global South and from the region.
Betty.
Thanks, Karen. And again, thank you so much. I think the fellow panelists have done an incredible job, I think it should definitely change the way we practice security, and more so because we've had a chance and opportunity to reflect and reimagine what our realities would look like. And we know that what it wasn't really working. Now, how do we reimagine and make things better? What can we do differently to make it work for everybody that's important? And I think that should be the key going forward. And yeah.
Thanks so much. We've got a couple of questions. First one, are the reasons we haven't seen a strong gendered response and understanding by decision makers during the pandemic the same as other crises, or are they different or additional? Whoever wants to tackle that one first.
Can I speak to that? Because I've seen it in other humanitarian crises in our Pacific Island region, particularly in 2016. Fiji had, a Category 5 TC Winston, and we were talking to a number of people, including to bring in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and it was almost about putting it aside, letting women, yes, we know you want to talk about your protection issues, and limiting us to that space. So for me, it's really important that we aren't making the same mistakes. And that's what I mean in terms of the development partners, bilaterals, the governments as well. sometimes there is a notion that militaristic responses are just so efficient and just very easy and precise without actually thinking about the social, economic, political implications even of what does that look like in terms of this different type of power. So for me, that's really important, and to bring it back into inclusive peace, development, humanitarian response, and learning from other crisis situations. I mean, my own learning was after the Asian tsunami and how women mobilized in South Asia to adapt the women, peace and security to that major humanitarian crisis. So I think it's a couple of different things that we continue to learn, but we also have to make sure that we remain persistent and consistent on this path of bringing women, peace and security into this discussion, which quite often, as I said earlier on, oh, it's not a conflict, it's a health crisis. So yeah, we've just got to be more determined, better resourced, and being able to get women into those spaces virtually, using innovation with technology at this time to really start to unpack their realities and communicate these to the decision makers.
Thanks very much. Does anyone else from our panel want to add on?
I can jump in, and then I think it's a brilliant question and something for myself personally to reflect on. And so this is not going to be a very convincing answer, but I think when, again, looking at, for example, conflicts and disasters and climate change and the pandemic, there are different differences, and existing scholarship on this would probably differentiate between rapid onset types of crises and slow moving forms of crises. And therefore, you know, an easy comparison is we have not seen the same political will and attention to climate change or the climate crises compared to how already we were so easily, you know, pushed into lockdown, and these, you know, for some, it's quite radical to be wearing a mask already. And so there are clear differences, but I think something to reflect on is, again, that certain differences matter. The temporal and spatial dimensions of crises would probably matter here, but there should be a distinction between inherent or innate differences in the types of hazards and risks, and how these hazards and risks are socially constructed. And particularly, we might see that through the responses. And as we've discussed in this panel, what tends to be replicated is this very militarized, short-sighted tyranny of urgency sort of response to crises, and therefore, if we keep seeing this template applied from one crisis to another, we should not be surprised that the outcomes that we are seeing gets to recur from one crisis to another as well. And that's where we see the same gendered assumptions replicated around women's self-sacrificing behaviors, for example, or the inequalities around, you know, that we would expect a very militarized response to be reallocating resources, and that gender budgets are the first to take a hit. So perhaps there's something there to reflect on, but I'm very grateful for that question.
We had another question which is kind of related. What previous pandemics or national emergencies in Australia or elsewhere have disrupted access to resources and opportunity for women and minority groups that we can point to and say, look what happened here, let's ensure this doesn't happen again with COVID-19? I think you already touched on this, Sharon, but I wondered if you or the other panelists want to reflect on that more.
Well, I'll quickly respond to it. And I think that comes to my mind every single time I see reports on a natural disaster everywhere, really. We've got so many lessons learned, and we shouldn't be repeating those mistakes, and as Sharon said, but we haven't seemed to, you know, figure out the formula for getting it right. So I think there's still a lot more work to be done, but now more than ever, we actually have the resources and the technology to make it happen. And so I think collaboration and cooperation might just be the solution going forward. So.
It's so great. Well, it is 3 o'clock, so I think that's probably a good point to bring the conversation to a close. Remembering that this is just an initial conversation, and I'm really looking forward to more discussions on gender, peace and security, and how we can rethink security, and how we can redefine resilience and redesign the table, and all of these great concepts that we've been talking about today. So thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks so much to our speakers. And let's pause but not finish the conversation there. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks so much, Karen, for organizing. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.